I remember hiking the Lost Coast Wilderness in California, and I saw a banana slug, and it really was long, really big. You can see why they named them that. But interesting thing I learned about slugs, I went to a wildlife certification, a tracking certification. I didn't do great. I keep trying, but I don't know if I'm suited for it. But anyway, they showed us this mushroom, and they said, what happened? What was eaten on this mushroom? And I'm like, my friend is a wildlife biologist. She had already figured it out. They were slugs. So sometimes you'll see like little mushrooms, they'll have these little tracks in them, and those were slugs were eating on those. Of course, a lot of other critters eat on them too. So.
Master Wildlife Conservationist Ginny Apple is on Zoom with friends from the Dam Hunt Library, not to discuss slugs, but Connecticut's changing landscape.
Changing landscapes really apply to most everywhere in our country. Some of the southwestern desert areas don't alter quite as much as our environments, but every environment does alter and is altered either by natural happenings or by human encroachment. So that's a little bit of what we'll talk about today. So Connecticut landscapes, in the beginning, there were forests, not. As you can see, 26,000 years ago in the Wisconsin Ice Age, in 13,000 years ago, tundra dominated, then spruce woodlands. And when the humans arrived, then 9,000 years ago, pine and hemlock forests showed up, then mixed deciduous. Then our regal American chestnuts, which, you know, suffered from a blight around the turn of the 20th century and pretty much all didn't survive. So around 500 years before the colonists arrived, Native Americans began to set up subsistence farming. They were America's first environmentalists, and the land they lived on remained relatively unspoiled. The Native Americans did have a type of crop rotation. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that as many as 50,000 Native Americans inhabited the area known as Connecticut. They would hunt and fish when game was available. They cultivated many vegetables that we do, beans, pumpkin, squash, corn, in areas that they had burned to clear just near the shore. They would clear certain plots of land twice a year by burning. They wanted to create edges on the forest and less density in the woods, and that would allow fruits and berries and fruit-bearing trees to grow. When the colonists arrived, they were astonished that the Native Americans had such agrarian cultures. And so they started kind of duplicating that, often on land that they had overtaken from Native Americans. So they came around in the early 1600s. Our landscape was pretty much about 95% forested. For a time, the American traders, if you heard my beaver talk, you know, they pretty much used the Native Americans to track beavers, and the beaver pelt industry pretty much helped fuel the colonies and get them out of debt because they got so much for these beaver hides. And also they got a lot of money for some of the wood that they would send over to England. So from colonial times, though, until the mid-19th century, the dominant view of wildlife and its management was kind of dualistic. Wildlife species were divided into good animals, those which had commercial value or could be eaten, or bad animals, those which threatened the colonists' safety or food supply. I always like to include some quotes. A Native American chief, we must protect the forest for our children, grandchildren, and children yet to be born. We must protect the forest for those who can't speak for themselves, such as the birds, animals, fish, and trees. One of the reasons I do volunteer and give wildlife talks is I take very seriously the protection of our wildlife and our environment. By the late 1700s, again, over 75% of land area had been cleared for farming. So the typical mid to late 18th century household used 20 to 40 cords of wood annually. So it's estimated the forest cover in Connecticut reached its lowest point between 1825 and 1850. So here are our animals that were driven or hunted out or extirpated. That's a term used by our biologists, extirpated, which means a local extinction. It's when a species no longer exists in a particular area, but still exists somewhere else. So the last documented wolf was shot and dead in 1742. Wild turkeys were extirpated in Connecticut in 1813. Beavers were gone by 1842. Timber rattlers, which we do have in some healthy pockets throughout the state, but not statewide, they were close to exterminated by the early 1800s. Black bears extirpated by the mid 1800s. And from 1700 to 1900, the white-tailed deer, which numbered in the tens and tens of thousands when the first settlers first came, were uncommon because of over-harvesting for venison and deer skins. They also did marking hunting, and also with the clearing of the trees, there was a general loss of deer habitat. Mountain lions were killed because they were predators and thus were extirpated from the state in the early 1700s. If you talk to the animals, they will talk with you, and you will know each other. If you do not talk to them, you will not know them. And what you do not know, you will fear. What one fears, one destroys. But the Industrial Revolution by the mid 1800s is pretty much what gave much of the land back to nature. Industry and manufacturing replaced farming by the 1850s as the economic mainstay here in Connecticut. Many of these industrial centers rose along fast-flowing rivers and streams. You would be surprised and shocked how many mills there were along all these streams. By the mid 1800s, it was more, people had migrated to the west following a lot of the old beaver trapping trails. It became much more economical and the land was more suited for raising huge crops. So a lot of people went west. A lot of Civil War veterans were offered free land out towards the Midwest. And a lot of people went west, guess what, for the gold rush. So those fields out there were just richer for supplying food to all parts of the country. And this is, again, what drove a lot of our farmers into the cities. But at the start of the 20th century, even though there was regeneration happening, our forests still were in pretty poor condition. So, and as our lands revert back to forests, some of this wildlife is returning, some through reintroduction, some through migration. Our bears are back, pretty much filtering down from Massachusetts and other places. anyway, black bears returned and a healthy population exists. But for these great, magnificent creatures, there's it's a kind of a teeter-totter between civilization with habituation by seed and stuff. But their existence here is testament to the health of our ecosystem. So we must strive to let them coexist. They're not normally aggressive towards humans, but they are powerful animals. Usually they will flee at the sight of humans or smell a person, but they will become bold if they smell food at campsites, compost piles, and garbage areas. The best way to keep a bear away is to not leave food around. And this also means pet food and bird seed. So wild turkeys are a visible species with an interesting story in Connecticut. They were eliminated from the state by the early 1800s. They're now common, more than common in Connecticut, and they're found in all of our 160 towns, 69 towns and cities. They were initially brought back to the state through a trap and relocation project between 1975 and 1992. They were captured in New York and then relocated in northwestern Connecticut. Now that Connecticut's land is returned to forests, they have thrived and they have the habitat they need to survive. So our white-tailed deer, very beautiful, pretty ubiquitous in Connecticut. They were almost entirely gone, though, from the state with the elimination of forest habitat. And they were hunted, for food, of course, and for their hides. In 1893, citizens of Connecticut reported only 12 deer, and that was due to the loss of mature forest and unrestricted hunting. Today, there are over 100,000 in Connecticut. So we talked about the beaver. Again, that's an important keystone species to our ecosystems. They were virtually gone by the mid-1800s. Mostly because of the demand of their pelts. They were actually, as I said, the coinage of early America, and they were traded between the settlers and the English mostly. In 1914, they were reintroduced to the state in the town of Union, which is in kind of northern Connecticut, to create wetlands. There were also additional reintroductions in other areas of the state. So they build the dams. It holds back enough water to flood the forest and creates water depth and creates many, many resources for all kinds of animals, birds, even plants. And so these are important habitats. So the fisher, remember fishers, not fisher cat, they're weasels. They're very dependent on forest habitat. And now that we do have healthy forests, they are thriving. They did, unlike the bears, they did need a little help repopulating the forests in mostly northwestern Connecticut to begin with. They were scarce due to forest clearing and overexploitation for their furs. By the early 1900s, they were considered gone from the state. Another animal this was not native to Connecticut. It came from the West, but it does thrive in forests. But it does adapt to almost any habitat, the eastern coyote. If you live in the Northeast, it's usually called coyote. If you live out West, you usually say coyote. Both are right. So they're highly adaptable. They can see a hunter from a mile away. And it's good they have such a defense because it's open season on coyote every day of the year in Connecticut. That was put in for farmers to be able to protect their livestock. And these are some of our great animals we have in the state. There's 84 species of mammals in Connecticut. 335 species of birds, 50 species of reptiles and amphibians, 169 species of fish, and an estimated 20,000 vertebrates. This diversity is attributable because even though we're a small state, we have a wide variety of landscapes, waterscapes, and habitats from, of course, the coastal plains to our northwest hills.